Morning, Derek.
Hi, John.
Hi. So, tell me then about the book Rock'n'Roll Unravelled.
Well, what it is, it's not it's 700 pages, and it's not a start at the beginning, read through to the end. It's in three specific parts. You've got the centre part, which is a diary, basically. So it looks at all the stories that are told on the day they happened. So 1st of January through 31st of December.
Oh, wow.
And then to give that context, the first part of the book is the timeline, and that then lists every one of those events in chronological order. What's dynamite about that is you can actually see what else was happening when a particular event was going on. Like when the Beatles released Love Me Do in the UK in October '62, it was just 2 weeks before the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the world literally stood on the edge of a nuclear war.
It's interesting, isn't it, Derek? You know, to think what's going on, the sort of external influences on. Do you think it had an impact on the music?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the book as well goes into, as well as the music, it's very much a story of rock and roll from its roots through to mid-'70s punk. So it sort of finishes essentially with the Sex Pistols. Last concert in early 1978. But you're right. I mean, one of the things I wanted to do when I wrote the book was bring in as many influences and backgrounds as possible. And one of the big ones on the music of certainly the 60s was the Vietnam War. So the highlights, if you like, or the main events, they're not really highlights, of the Vietnam War are there. And also the Civil Rights Movement, because that had a really big impact on the music of the 50s and 60s, because America was very much terrified of communism. That's what the Vietnam War was all about in the 50s and 60s. And a lot of the folk singers, people like Woody Guthrie and Pete Seeger particularly, fell foul of the American witch hunts for communists in the 50s. I mean, Pete Seeger was banned from appearing on TV for quite a long while. So those influences are really quite important, I think, on the development of rock.
And, you know, when, rock and roll music sort of first appeared on the scene, I heard somebody refer to the music industry now as fast food music, disposable and everything like that. But back then, when you had the birth of rock and roll, it was a revolution, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, what it did, rock and roll came together in the mid-'50s, and what it did, it brought together sort of two strands of music, sort of black music, which was based in gospel, blues, jazz, R&B, and white music, which came from hillbilly music, country and western, and that kind of music. And then around, the first song that's credited with being called the first rock and roll record is often thought as being Jackie Brenston's Rocket 88. I think it was 1950 or 51 that was released. But what kick-started rock and roll was the movie Blackboard Jungle in '56, when it played Bill Haley's Rock Around the Clock over the opening credits.
Oh,
it was a movie about teenage delinquency in a school in New York, and for some reason, because the song had been recorded about a year, 18 months earlier, and was the B-side of 13 women and only one man in town. It just sank without trace. But for some reason, when it played against the backdrop of the opening credits for Blackboard Jungle, it just hit a nerve, and rock and roll was united around the world. People were dancing in the aisles in cinemas. They were ripping up seats.
Causing mayhem.
Oh, absolutely. Rock and roll was born on many levels. The other interesting thing then about the 50s is what people probably don't realize now is there hasn't always been a sort of teenage marketplace. That didn't really start until, James Dean and the likes in the mid-50s. And the first real teenage fashions and whole culture didn't really appear till the 1960s. I mean, I'm of that era, and I can remember that there was a rite of passage. This was the days of the 11 plus. When you went from small school to the big school, when you passed or failed the 11 plus. And the real rite of passage at that stage was when you left the small school and went to the big school, by and large, that's when most boys moved out of short trousers into long trousers.
Okay.
And typically, you were just a little version of your dad or your mum. There was no teenage culture as such.
So how do you feel about that? A little version of your dad and your mum. Is that how you want to be described at the time?
Well, very much it was like that.
Yeah.
In terms of you dressed in the same way. As I say, you had short trousers till you were 11, and then long trousers, and then it was shirts and ties and the like. You did have in the 50s. You had the sort of teddy boy movement, and they had their own particular fashions of drain pipe trousers. Which are very reminiscent of the tight trousers that are seen nowadays, interestingly enough.
These things come round, don't they? They sort of come back in fashion.
Oh, absolutely.
Yes.
What goes around comes around.
Exactly.
Still waiting for flares to come back, though. They seem to be hanging around before making yet another revival.
Yes, we'll have to wait for that one, see what the next fashion is going to be, the next recycled fashion.
Exactly.
It is interesting, though. So rock and roll really sort of gave young people an identity, really, I suppose.
Very much so. It really did come out of the music, and that's. I mean, this all sort of then slowly but surely developed, so that you had a whole different set of values, and there was a great divide between the sort of young teenage people and the older previous generation, and a lot of what we're seeing today, you could really trace back to the late 50s and certainly the 60s, when the Vietnam War was very much protested by students of the day.
And what I love, Derek, at the moment is the fact that vinyl is making a comeback, and you can see people going back into the high street shops and looking through vinyl. Maybe young people that didn't experience vinyl first time around, and it's just really nice to see that, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's nothing like holding a 12-inch album, the artwork. If you look back at some of particularly in the 60s, Pink Floyd albums, Yes albums, they had amazing, and the whole progressive era had loads of really astounding images on the albums. And, when you get a gatefold album, it's twice as big. And there's nothing quite like it, really. And the music as well, a lot of people argue that it sounds better on vinyl because it's analog, it's not digital. So with digital, you've got a sort of step function so that it's moving in steps all the time. But with analog, it's just a straight line, so you're going up and down in a straight line. I'm not sure how many people's hearing is quite up to that. I'm sure mine isn't.
But it's how it's supposed to sound, though. It's how the music was recorded. And if you're listening to music, especially from the 60s and the early rock and roll songs, to have it on vinyl, it's a certain, it's authentic, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And when you think something like, we're coming up to, I think, the 1st of June, 50 years ago, is the anniversary of Sgt. Pepper being released, which even today is still being voted one of the best albums of all time.
I can't believe that was 50 years ago. It's really stood the test of time, hasn't it?
That's right. It was the Summer of Love, 1967. There was an awful lot going on there. That's when psychedelic rock really reached its peak. But with Pepper, it was actually recorded on 2 4-track machines, and now you've got sort of zillion-track machines and overdubbing and all kinds of electronic ways of controlling stuff and pitch and all kinds of things. But then, and you think about the effects on that, and they basically recorded on a 4-track machine. They had a second 4-track machine they grouped stuff up on and then put it back in as tracks. But, that is absolutely amazing.
Yeah, really ahead of its time.
Oh, very much so. I mean, the Beatles really do deserve, I think, their unique place in rock and roll history. Because they weren't, another big difference then, of course, is artists would often be around for years before they were made the big time. I mean, the Beatles really very much started out in the sort of 56 era, and it wasn't until 1962 that they had their first hit in the UK. And then, of course, they cracked America in 64. And what had happened up until then, American rock and roll had very much dominated the 1950s. Although it died out around the end of the 50s, 58, 57 to 59. It was pretty much all over. And then you've got a sort of gap in music between about sort of 1959 and 1962. And what was interesting, in America, it went off into, I wouldn't say blind alleys, but cul-de-sacs, really. It had things like surf music, Phil Spector, dance music, dance crazes, and they were all great in themselves, but they weren't really going anywhere as such. But what happened in the UK in the very early 60s is the beat groups got together, the classic combination of two guitars, bass and drums, and maybe a singer standing out front. And a lot of the British bands went off to Hamburg and sort of served their apprenticeships there. So there was an awful lot of those kind of beat bands coming through. So when the Beatles hit with Love Me Do in October 1962, a whole new era of music burst on the scene.
Yes, the Hard Day's Night movie as well, which I was watching just recently, actually. You see the crowds and just again, another revolution in the world of music. Very
much so. And what was great was when he got to 64 and the Beatles appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show, and their music started to take off in America. You had what's called the British invasion, and between 64 and 66, the American bands couldn't get a look in. The British, it's talk about taking coals to Newcastle, and a lot of these bands were playing the old R&B blues standards that they'd learned from the American artists of the 40s and 50s. So they took that back and completely dominated the American music scene, to the extent that American bands were attempting to get airplay by calling themselves things like the Beefeaters to sound British. And I mean, the Beefeaters didn't have a lot of success under that name, but they changed their name to the Birds, and they had a hit or two themselves after that.
It's great to see us Brits being, being at the forefront of the music industry there.
Oh, very much. That early, middle 1960s was certainly dominated by the Brits. But when you get to then 65, 66, that was really the birth of rock music. That's when rock and roll morphed into the much harder-edged rock music with people like Cream and Jimi Hendrix. I mean, it was interesting. Jimi Hendrix had been beavering away over in the States for years. Before Chas Chandler, the Animals bass player. The Animals came to the end of their life while they were on a tour in America. And Chas Chandler, the bass player, fancied getting into management. And I think it was Keith Richards' girlfriend said, "Come to the Café War, there's this amazing guitarist." So he saw him and thought, "Wow, this guy's pretty good." Persuaded Hendrix to come to England. And they recruited a bass player and a drummer, Noel Redding, Mitch Mitchell, and became Jimi Hendrix Experience. And again, a whole new era of music was evolving. Because then, there'd been nothing like that. I remember buying the Jimi Hendrix's first album, Are You Experienced? And I was in a group at the time. I mean, lots of people my age, sort of teenage, mid-60s, were in local bands. I used to play the drums. And I remember jumping on the bus with the new album in hand, going over to Buns's, the bass player, saying, "Buns, you've got to listen to this, man. It's absolutely unbelievable." And there'd been nothing like it before.
Well, we're going to take a break for a piece of music, so I'm going to play Harry Chaplin, and A Better Place to Be. So tell me, why is this song special to you, and Derek?
Oh, yeah, I'm a big fan of Harry Chapin and Warren Zevon, the singer-songwriters that tell stories. And this particular track, I think, is an amazing story. I used to play it all the time when I was in the car, and I'd be on tapes in those days, and listen to it, and it nearly moves you to tears.
Let's have a listen then, shall we?